All right, we are live. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela McArdle. I am the chair of the National Libertarian Party. And I have a special guest with me here, Caleb Maupin, who I became acquainted with through the Rage Against the War Machine rally. We have some pretty significant ideological differences, but we are both very anti war. And we've been able to develop a little bit of a working relationship that way and get to know one another. And, I don't want to steal his thunder, and I'll let him share a little bit more about himself, but he is a communist. And I know the collective heard around the internet, it'll be quite strong. But bear with me, everyone. I'd ask for you who are libertarians. I think this is a really important conversation for us to have. People have asked why I'm interviewing a communist. Um, well, on the one hand, I do think it's good that we work with literally anyone and everyone to stave off nuclear war. I do think that there's value in that. On the other hand, I'm trying to understand what's happening in the world around me. And the best way to do that, I think, is to engage with someone else who's part of this movement, whatever it is, communism, some people call it cultural Marxism. And I think we're going to hear from Caleb how he's, not woke and so on and so forth. But largely there are elements of what's happening in the world around me that I don't understand. And so I want to reach out and try to understand that. And I want to set the tone a little bit too. Like, Caleb, I don't know you very well, but you seem like a nice enough person, and you
Thank
don't
you.
seem you don't seem hell-bent on evil or inflicting suffering on all of mankind. So on the one level, it does kind of confound me that you consider yourself a communist, and I really want to try to understand you, and I'm going to do my best not to put words in your mouth. I really want us to be an example for other people on how to have a productive dialogue, and I hope that if the communist revolution ever happens, you'll remember that, and I'll be one of the last ones up against the wall.
Sure.
But why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background, and let's kind of like dig into just like kind of the basics.
Well, I guess I'll start out by saying I don't think it's just opposing war that we agree on. I'm also against the vaccine mandates. I'm also against tech censorship. I'm against the surveillance that's going on and the violation of our civil liberties. I'm against the emerging police state. I'm against a lot of these trade deals that hurt American jobs, et cetera. So I think that there is quite a bit of overlap beyond simply the issue of anti-war. But I'm an Irish American. I'm from a small town in Ohio. Are you Irish as well?
I am. I am.
Yeah, years ago, I met an Irish cop in Cleveland, and he said that he heard an expression that when an Irishman gets off the boat in a new country, the first question he asks is, "Does this country have a government?" And if the answer is yes, he says, "Well, I'm against it." So I think we're both true to our heritage in our own way. But I'm from a small town in Ohio. My mother was a librarian. And when I was in fourth grade, I walked the picket lines with her when she and the other librarians in Stark County, Ohio, went on strike, demanding better security protection at the library. There was a number of people that were coming in and doing crazy things, and they wanted more security protection. Stark County, Ohio, wasn't for it. So that's when I learned what a labor union was, and that was kind of my introduction to maybe things that might be considered communisty or whatever. I also then went with my dad to the Galapagos Islands because my dad had a side job, leading nature tours. He's a biologist. And, the Galapagos Islands are part of Quito, or they're part of Ecuador. And so we landed in Quito, the capital of Ecuador, at the time in 1999 when I was 12 years old, when they were having a huge famine. And I saw desperately poor, starving people all over the capital. And I was like, whoa, this is huge. I was from a small town in Ohio. There were kids who, lived in trailers that went to school with me. There were kids, from West Virginia. There was certainly not the kind of condition that we're thought to think of when we think of quote unquote white Americans as having this privileged, luxurious life, but nothing like the poverty that I saw when I was in Quito, Ecuador, in the middle of this disaster, this famine that had been kind of imposed on the country by the IMF and the World Bank and neoliberalism. And so all of that led me to oppose the Iraq War. I was very opposed to it because it was very obvious that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were not buddies and pals, and that the idea that Iraq was responsible for 9/11 or had weapons of mass destruction was a lie. And that led me to learning the history of the anti-war movement and Long story short, in Cleveland, Ohio, I was a communist activist. I videotaped the police beating up some high school students when they were walking out of school to protest teacher layoffs, and that got them acquitted in court and got me kind of profiled in the local news as a communist activist. I was in New York City. I worked for Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General, who ran the International Action Center. He was one of the biggest critics of the International Criminal Court, which is completely illegal under the UN treaty. There's just no basis for it. He represented Milosevic, he represented Saddam Hussein, and I worked for him. And I represented the International Action Center on international media. I was kind of their spokesperson during the Occupy Wall Street protests. I work now with international media. I'm a reporter for RT, and I run a think tank called the Center for Political Innovation. And I'm a communist as far as I'm concerned. Marxism, Leninism is the ideological basis through which I work on things. However, the woke left doesn't agree with that. They consider me to be a fascist and an evil cult leader and all kinds of awful things. So I've increasingly discovered that as I'm not comfortable and not really welcome in woke circles, I find myself getting along with conservatives a lot, and I'm not the only one. There's a whole pattern of people like this. Max Blumenthal, for example, the gray zone folks, they're widely hated by the woke crowd, but they do great work around vaccine mandates, around opposing wars, etc. I really like Jimmy Dore. I've been on his show before. I know we're both friends with Nick Brana, the founder of the People's Party. He's a friend of mine. And, there's a growing layer of division that's not so much about ideology. It's rather about where you stand on the actual issues. And it oddly parallels the lead up to the Second World War. In the United States, if you were involved in the labor movement and you were interested in communism and you supported Roosevelt and you supported Stalin, you could join the Communist Party. But if you considered yourself a communist and you didn't support Roosevelt and you didn't support Stalin and you considered yourself to be, critical of the war effort, you could join the Trotskyites. In Britain, there was a very right-wing conservative movement called the British Union of Fascists, led by Oswald Mosley. It was a conservative, young men, patriotic, socially conservative organization. And to counter it, because that was aligned with the Nazis, the British government set up something called the Oxford Group that was ultra-patriotic and socially conservative, but was on the other side and didn't support the Nazis. And in the lead up to World War II, every ideology kind of got divided, not by what you thought was the ideal world, but where you stood on the actual issues. And I see that happening in the United States. There are conservatives that I can get along with. There are conservatives I can't get along with. There are libertarians like yourself that I have a lot in common with. There's other libertarians that I don't so much have a lot in common with. And that there's a big divide. Do you support Julian Assange or don't you? Do you want to stop sending weapons to Ukraine while our country's falling apart or don't you? These are the big questions that are dividing us. And every ideology can be reinterpreted to take one side or the other. And I think that's, when we think about politics on a deeper level, there are real divisions among the rich and powerful right now. And I think where you line up on those divisions is more important and really kind of defining where the battle lines are being drawn.
I think first of all, that's a lot of really good history and information, because I don't think that those are things that people consider generally. I think that shows how we're able to work together on issue coalitions really well in the here and now and in the near future as well. And probably there are several things we've worked together, or at least been on the same side in the past. Like you said, the Iraq War, I assume Afghanistan, pretty much anything that involves the United States military jumping overseas and blowing up women and children and ruining weddings. I'm really curious though about like some of the underlying values, that you might have and how those translate, and line up, or maybe they don't line up with some of your beliefs. So like I grew up in a fairly, like a very conservative Christian Southern household. Slight difference though is that, my father was the minister of a Christian and Missionary Alliance church. And we had a strong emphasis on international missions, not militias. It was a small church. He never pastored a Mick church, anything like that. Like we did not have a lot of income growing up. And with the focus on international missions, they spent a lot of time reaching out to communist countries. And so we would have missionaries and people, who were essentially refugees come and speak with us all the time. And so I've met people who crawled out of Pol Pot's killing fields after being shot in the back of the head and miraculously survived. I've met people who, survived gulags in Soviet Russia, and people who survived persecution, had been locked in cages, kind of like John McCain alleges he was over in China. And, we definitely had a strong anti-communist bent in the home because what I was exposed to, from like 8 years old and onwards, like every couple of years, you would hear people come back with horror stories and sometimes, like literal scars. And it was, it definitely shaped my worldview, you know, like we had a very strong slant towards individualism, golden rule, responsibility, a pursuit of meaning. And we didn't have a lot of money, but I think that we still revered upward mobility economically. And, one of the things that I worry about the world now, especially with like woke culture, which I know you're not a part of, is they seem to like deeply resent upward economic mobility, and they love equality, but it seems to be to drag everyone down, not to bring people up. And I'm just curious, like, if you have any thoughts on that, where you differ, and if you can help kind of unravel that whole mess.
Well, this is where I have gotten widely canceled and attacked by the woke left, because I've pointed out that, what Karl Marx actually wrote was that the ultimate goal of communism, the ultimate vision of a world with no social hierarchies, with no government, where there is, from each according to their own ability to each according to their needs. He very clearly wrote that that is only possible when there is so much wealth in existence, when there is so much abundance that exists, that the need for these things fades away. If you read what he wrote, his understanding was you couldn't have a total communist society until you have a situation where labor becomes life's prime want and no longer a necessity, when technology has advanced so much that people only work to keep from being bored. And that Marx's understanding of communism, he said, right can never be higher than the social conditions thereby. And what he's talking about is that the history of humanity, the bulk of human civilization was hunter-gatherer civilization. We were hunting and gathering in the woods in tribes of like 20 or 30. But then, with our brilliance and our creativity, we developed, sticks and rocks, and we started, being able to hunt animals way more effectively. We developed an understanding of the patterns of plant growth. And that led human beings to the point that we got so good at hunting and gathering that there was a scarcity. So then we invented a new way of doing things with the origin of agriculture. We started domesticating animals. We started growing crops. And that was the first social revolution. And it led to a higher stage of development. And out of that, we got ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome and the slave empires. But slavery is a very inefficient way of doing things. Out of slavery came feudalism, which was much more efficient. And out of feudalism came the revolutions that broke apart feudalism, including the American Revolution of 1776, but the English Civil War, the French Revolution, and we got modern capitalism. And the understanding was that each time human beings were moving toward a higher mode of production, inventing new technology and advancing to a higher plane. And that the goal of communism, the idea is that, that the artificial restraints on human creativity that are created by the capitalist system, that these things can be overcome. In all systems that existed before, when people starved, it was because there was a shortage of food. But only under capitalism do you have a situation where people are hungry because there is too much food. In systems of the past, when you had homelessness, it was because there simply wasn't enough housing. But only under capitalism do you have a system where people become homeless because there is too much housing. And that capitalism creates this problem of poverty created by abundance. There's an old thing they talk about, the coal miner's riddle. The little boy says to his father, "Why is it so cold?" And the father says, "Because I can't afford any coal to heat the stove." And the little boy says to the father, "Why can't you afford any coal?" And he says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine. I got laid off." The little boy says, "Why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" He said, "Because there is too much coal." And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, that technological advancement and the ability to create abundance leads to a situation where the worker cannot buy back what he produces, and you have the frequent problem of glut. And that's, Keynesian economics is intended to address that issue. right? You know, it's the government hiring people to dig holes and then fill them back in. And the idea is that gets people spending when you have this problem of a glut on the market. Well, Marxism says that you know, the problem of overproduction can be resolved by having rational planning of the economy. And that will lead human beings to create a higher level of abundance, to outstrip the narrow limits of the profit system. And that can lead us to eventually get to that world of vast abundance. Now, the woke left doesn't believe this at all. They believe in degrowth. They think economic growth is bad. They openly want everyone to be poorer. That is not in Marx anywhere. You will not find that in Marx anywhere. And if you look at when the Soviet communists took power, they didn't make Soviet Russia poorer. They turned it into an industrial superpower that was able to defeat the Nazis, that invented space travel. The Chinese communists have not made China poorer. They've made it the second largest economy in the world. You know, under the leadership of Gaddafi, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. So the idea that we want to make people poorer, that's absolutely true regarding the woke left, who I would argue are actually Malthusians, and that they work for the ultra rich from the foundations that pay them, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller think tanks, et cetera. And they're trying to stabilize capitalism with forcible degrowth. And I would argue that that is the economics of fascism. That is not the economics of communism. I would argue that the economics of communism, in the way we can understand it now, because a lot has changed. We're seeing in Vietnam, we're seeing in China, we're seeing in Nicaragua with the Bolivarian government, which is also a Christian government. I've been there to Nicaragua. Their slogan that they have painted everywhere is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. They actually have some of the strictest anti-abortion laws in the world. You know, there is a global communist movement that exists that has, I mean, there's the whole province of India called Kerala that's run by the Communist Party. You know, there's many countries, Belarus, Angola, and South Africa. The Communist Party is a very big part of the African National Congress, and you have the economic freedom fighters, and that communism is a global movement that is about organizing the economy in order to ensure economic growth. I just want to say one more thing on what you said, which is that I am a Christian myself. And I think that if we can learn anything from the history of 20th century communism, is that the oppression of Christians that went on was abominable and horrendous. And I think that it was based on seeing the church as an oppressive institution. It was based on the old regime having justified itself in the name of religion, but it was absolutely horrendous. And I'm happy to say that the head of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, he is a Russian Orthodox Christian. Maduro in Venezuela is a Christian. Hugo Chavez before him was a Christian. Nicaragua, their leader, Daniel Ortega, is also a Christian. And I think that we can pretty fairly say that what went on in the 20th century, the way Christians were treated, was absolutely horrendous, and that's one thing that the communist world has really tried to correct.
I appreciate hearing all of that. It's a lot to unpack. I took a couple of notes. Let's go back to artificial restraints of capitalism. You spelled it out, I think, pretty well, but I think there's still room for me to kind of ask some questions and try to understand. Like from a libertarian perspective, I see a lot of regulatory frameworks that, impede people. What's a good way to say it? Benefiting from exponential economic growth, from innovation, government artificial monopolies, doing things that, don't allow people to really reach their full economic potential. The way you sort of unpacked the artificial restraints of capitalism and talked about poverty created by abundance was like pretty interesting. I mean, Keynesianism seems to me, like central market manipulation. It seems like when we do that on a grand scale, we end up with really bad outcomes. Are there any good outcomes?
Well, the Keynesian solution, which is just we have the government dump a lot of money. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't really resolve the problem. The Great Depression was obviously not solved. I think it was great that Roosevelt hired millions of unemployed people, gave them a job and wages, and then paved roads and built Key West Highway and, built LaGuardia Airport and built all kinds of post offices. And that kind of laid the basis for the economic boom that came after World War II. But that said, it didn't solve the problem of the Great Depression. And that these Keynesian solutions, just kind of having the government dump money, it may abet people's suffering, unemployed people get a job, people get some services, et cetera, but it doesn't address the underlying problem. So I would agree with you there, because I mean, it's not socialism. I mean, it's still capitalism. It's still production organized for profit, with the government taxing people and then dumping a lot of money and trying to keep the economy rolling. The military industrial complex is the same thing, right? And that's funny, because we think of, it's like the welfare state is associated with liberals. The military industrial complex is associated with conservatives, but they're both basically the government dumping lots of money into the economy to try and keep it rolling on, to resolve this built-in problem of overproduction, that the worker is just never paid back enough to, buy back the product he produces. And that is just a built-in problem. This problem of glut is not a problem that you see in any other previous system. And that I think that the economic crisis that the world is in right now, the long-term global economic crisis, is based on the fact that we have had the computer revolution. Artificial intelligence has taken the issue of people being removed from the assembly line, workers' role in production being reduced. It's taken that to levels that Karl Marx could never have even imagined. And because of that, there's millions and millions of people that don't have a place in their global assembly line. And in a rational society, that would be a great thing, because there'd be less work for everyone to do. Self-driving cars should be a great thing, right? All this unnecessary labor now, driving, traffic courts, all these things are no longer needed. They're no longer needed. She's, I guess, restarting her laptop. But these things would no longer be needed because of the problem of I'm sorry. Now I'm a little bit distracted. Angela's messaging me. She says, hold on, that her laptop has powered down. She'll be right back. So I was making the point that that under capitalism, the economy has this problem where technological advances that should lead to prosperity and abundance lead to greater poverty, and that's a problem. So I hope Angela's back soon. I'll try not to make any points that she can't respond to. We're just kind of waiting for her to come back. So, I'm texting her that I'm trying to entertain everyone in her absence. So this is wild. This is wild, right? Are you back? Are you back?
I swear I'm being tormented by the feds.
Good. I was going to start tap dancing. So there you go.
I'm glad you just take off thinking, have I been trolled? The answer is yes. I think we've both been trolled. I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay.
Government. It's 'cause they're terrorizing me because Bobby Kennedy's going to announce tomorrow, sending me a message.
Speaking of which, there's rumors that he's running with you all. Is that true? Can you say?
I guess I'll know tomorrow.
Okay.
You know as much as I do. It's
right.
rumors at this point. Okay, so you've had a lot of things to say about Keynesianism and it not being what we need, and capitalism and the artificial growth of capitalism. I guess we'll just kind of wanted to wait to get to it, but you did touch on it a little bit, on the industrial powerhouse that Russia became after they defeated the Nazis, and they did defeat the Nazis. And I know that makes a lot of typical Americans ass mad to hear that said, but they did, we have to just give credit where credit is due. But, I know that, Soviet Russia got rockets into space. They certainly did that. I'm a little bit concerned about some of the other stuff that happened though. And I think that's where most libertarians and conservatives and the average individuals, starts to kind of freak out a little bit, is a lot of people died. And, I don't think it's productive to argue about the number of people that died, because once it gets that high, what does it really matter? And I'm just wondering if you could sort of break some of that down. How does a system that's supposed to be so good for you end up with something that goes so wrong? All the people that died, during the Soviet era and the gulags and all of that. And we don't have to unpack it all today in one conversation, but maybe we can unpack a little bit of it.
Well, I want to say that I guess this has a lot to do with why I became the hardline communist I am today, because I was a 90s kid, and the way I was taught about communism, and I think we're roughly the same age, right? So I think you probably heard the same thing, was that communism just failed everywhere it's ever been tried. It just doesn't work. That's what I was taught, and everyone knew this. This was just fact. And I got vaguely interested in communism at a young age. And, I mean, I'm from a religious background. I'd heard that communism was some idea of building a more moral society, but doing so without God. I had vague understanding. So I went to the library and I got a book called The Revolution Betrayed by Stalin's worst enemy, Trotsky. And I got that book because I was going to learn why the Soviet system wasn't real communism or something like that. Well, the first chapter was called What Has Been Achieved. And it was nothing but economic statistics about steel production, about wheat production, about the oil industry that they'd built. And they were having astronomical successes. The country was becoming like overnight an industrial superpower. And I thought, well, this can't be true because everybody knows communism just doesn't work. It just doesn't work as an economic system. This can't be true. And so I went and I got this ancient item no one's ever heard of anymore called an encyclopedia. And I fact checked it and it was true. And it was just infuriating to me. And from then on, I became this like defender of communism because I just felt like what I'd been told about it being a complete economic failure was not the case. Now, as far as, the big numbers that you're throwing out there, right? That's usually numbers that come out of a famine, a crisis of malnutrition. And those numbers, the way that they reach them, that's for academics to debate. But you have to remember that before the communists took power, there were big number famines like that all the time. The Chinese society, they had had 2 opium wars where free trade was forced on them by the British. They estimate that at least 100 million people died because the British prevented them from protecting their own industries, kept the country regionally balkanized so that when there would be a food crisis, they couldn't get food to one region to another. And that, the British Empire created mass starvation and famines all over the world. And that, China, when it was under the grip of British bankers and others, it was having famines like that all the time where millions of people were starving. Russia, with its primitive, pre-industrial economy, its agrarian economy before the revolution, people were dying of malnutrition all the time. It was the communists who brought tractors to the countryside. It was the communists who built power plants so that there could be electricity in the country. And it's like, was there a famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s? Absolutely. Was it horrendous? Absolutely. Did a lot of people who shouldn't have died? Absolutely. Were there decisions and policies that Soviet leaders made that probably contributed to that? Absolutely. But is that therefore the whole story of everything that happened with communism? No. That is something that happened under the old system all the time, happening again in a context of it shouldn't have happened. But the story there is that it was communism that cured these things from happening. It's communism, it's the leadership of the Communist Party that's turned China into the second largest economy in the world, that electrified, industrialized China, et cetera. So that's like a selective interpretation. And that's where these big numbers come from. And as far as political repression, look, I am against the violation of anyone's human rights. I am in favor of civil liberties, but you do have to remember 15 different countries invaded Russia after the Russian Revolution, 15 countries. There was a civil war and there was a blockade. They couldn't import any medicine. People were dying. And that in that context, the Soviet Union became a very militarized authoritarian society. And they, in this militarized authoritarian context, were able to industrialize. And then the Nazis invaded, and then 27 million people died in World War II, but they took Berlin. And that the conditions through which their society was developing were not conditions that are, very tangible to an open and free society. And one of the things that frustrates me a lot is that, that nobody in the world was talking about the right of freedom of speech, the right of freedom of religion, the right of freedom of assembly until like the 1400s in Europe. And why was that? Were people just evil until then? And one day John Locke was born and suddenly he was moral and we started respecting people's rights? No. It's that we had not yet reached an economic mode of production and a level of abundance that could facilitate those kinds of rights. Try running a medieval feudal commune on the basis of everyone being able to say whatever they want, believe whatever they want. It wouldn't work, right? The people of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, they weren't evil, and that's why they violated people's rights and had an authoritarian structure. It's because that was the mode of production that existed, and it was the overthrow of feudalism came about as a result of the economic changes. You had the Silk Road that came in from China. You had the rise of the mercantile class, and that there was a new level of abundance that necessitated and allowed for a new level of freedom. And ultimately, I want there to be so much abundance that we have total freedom. I don't want there to be any government at all. I don't want there to be any coercion at all. I want people to be able to just do what they feel like doing. That's what I want. But I think the road to doing so is getting beyond a system where profit dictates production. You're a mother. I mean, you talk about being a mother. I mean, would you let an invisible hand take care of your child? I don't think you would. Right. I mean, and that laissez-faire and just letting the market solve things, the chaos of the market is not something we should allow to have control over the lives of millions of people. Now, I do think you need market mechanisms, and we learned that. I mean, China has benefited a lot from adopting market policies. The government shouldn't be making children's toys. It shouldn't be running hotels and restaurants. But I think the government should be running healthcare. I think the government should be running the steel industry. I think the government should be running the power plants and electricity. I think the banking should be done strategically in the interest of the country overall. But yes, you need market mechanisms for consumer goods, for things that make life pleasurable. I think we learned that from the Cold War, that the Stalin model is very effective at rapidly industrializing countries. But after that, once people have education and they have housing and they have electricity, after that, it starts to stagnate a little bit. And that's why Deng Xiaoping was very brilliant. The reforms that he did that really saved China. And that's why China didn't collapse the way the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union needed reform in the 1980s. There's no question about it. But they couldn't bend, so they broke. Well, China has been able to bend and reinvent itself constantly. And that has been to their strength.
You talked about feudalism and not changing. The overthrow of feudalism in China was pretty violent. I think a lot of people died there, and I think there's sometimes a little bit of a misunderstanding on what Chinese landlords were. That it was more like feudalism than what you think about, as a landlord here in the United States. But it makes me, a little nervous, suspicious of a movement, whether it's political, cultural, or both, that would encourage people murdering feudal families, and peasantry, even if they were wealthy peasants, whatever that means. I mean, I know that you know what that means. It's like that Stalinism, gulags, and I hear you when you say countries invaded, but the gulag system seemed pretty brutal, and I seem to see like a pattern emerge where there's just like a lot of violence, and people are going to die. I understand that's like the default condition of humanity is we live and we die. But like in my perspective, capitalism, which I guess maybe we didn't define that initially. Free markets for me, maybe that's a better term. Maybe people think of capitalism as the government being involved. Like free markets tend to have less violent outcomes and to allow more for individualism than communism and systems that seem to really control what happens very, very aggressively from the top down to the bottom. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you kind of reconcile what seems to be like really violent, like actively violent, not passively violent, like tragedy? How do you reconcile that with being a Christian, or do you have like a different explanation for that?
Well, I think that in order to address your point, I have to clarify something, which
Sure.
is that you're referring to capitalism as kind of like Ayn Rand, as an unknown ideal, I would assume, right? You're not referring to the system that we live under now as capitalism.
Well, because I don't think that it really is.
Okay.
I mean, the government interference, right? Is
I mean,
not
I would
capitalism.
say that, I mean, capitalism, as I understand it, the system of private ownership of the means of production
Yes.
organized for profit, began with mass genocide. First in Europe, with the clearing of the commons, where these peasants whose families had lived there for centuries were driven off the land, and then they just started executing homeless people. King Henry VIII executed thousands of people for being vagabonds. It was a crime, and they were hung, and they cleared, the enclosure
That's
movement.
government, though.
Well, yes, but it was in order to secure. They were taking what was, the feudal common property. They were breaking it up and making it private land. And in order to do that, thousands and thousands of people were killed. And the Scottish Highlands were cleared in a similar manner. I mean, mass genocide there. And then you had the transcontinental slave trade. And then you had the Native Americans. And then you had, war after war after war. And it's like, if you're going to talk about violence, the system that we currently live under, which I understand is not the libertarian ideal of capitalism, but is the system that I see myself as opposing, there's violence to create it. There's violence to maintain it. There's a body count that goes on all the time.
But I wouldn't
Because of
call
it.
that,
So,
I mean, I wouldn't
yeah.
call that the free market. I'd call that like aggressive, literal government interference. That is literally the king coming in and murdering people. When I think about free markets, I think about deregulating the eyeglasses industry so that people can do, whatever they want with medicine. I think about how, like, it's illegal for me to get a certain type of stem cell therapy in the United States. You can go and get it in Mexico. I've had the lesser version here in the United States, which was great, and it was still extremely helpful for my Crohn's disease. But I wish I could have afforded to go to Thailand, and get it where it was completely deregulated. I really do, like, I think about free markets, not government. I want to get as far away from government as I can, like in as many areas as possible. And to that extent, like, I do welcome the invisible hand. I would rather be governed by the invisible hand, but then, like, like the communist fist.
Well, let me ask. I mean, has this ideal free market you describe ever existed anywhere?
It pops up in a few places. It pops up particularly in industries that are unregulated. Like, that's really what I'm thinking about, is unregulated industries. I don't think that we've seen truly like a libertarian living, since at least the expansion into the West in certain parts of the United States. Certainly, like the United States post-Revolutionary War. It's not anarcho-capitalism, but it was definitely very libertarian.
Sure. I mean, however, we did have a national bank back then, and that was a big part of Hamiltonian economics, was the creation of a government bank that would loan money to states to build lighthouses. And so, I mean, it's not completely.
People were able to circumvent it a little bit, though, and Andrew Jackson crushed it.
Yes.
That was his big fight. He crushed plenty of other things too, though it's not so impressive or proud of. But
Sure.
but yeah, for me, it's free markets, and it's like, so many of my criticisms of communism, it's not just exclusive to communism, although I think communism is like the distillation of the things that I find the worst in government, but it is government in general. So don't think that I'm picking on you exclusively.
Okay,
it's
sure.
all of them. All
Yeah.
of them. It's bad to worse.
Sure. Well, I feel like this is more a question of, we're arguing against kind of an ideal. But even like the ideal you describe, right? So in this hypothetical free market with no government intervention, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, due to the way the market works, some people would end up with a lot more wealth and money than other people, just because that's the way it is. So what would stop those people in this hypothetical situation from then going to the, bare bones government that exists in these circumstances that just protects private property, and using their wealth and influence to then change the rules, and we're right back where we started?
Freedom of choice is really important. I mean, the Constitution is not perfect. Obviously, it hasn't been a perfect system of checks and balances, but generally, the less government regulation and burden we have, the more innovation we have, the less people are held back, and the less the government is kicking in doors and dragging people into jail for breaking their laws. And I don't believe in utopia. I don't believe there's a libertarian utopia any more than I believe there's a communist utopia. And a lot of that has to do with human nature. And yeah, I guess maybe I'm curious what you think about human nature as well. Like, as a Christian, like, do you think people are mostly good, evil? Is it just that they have the capacity to do both? Like, kind of, where are you at on that?
Well, the human nature argument, that's the standard thing I've heard. People say communism doesn't work because of human nature, but the nature of human beings changes in different circumstances. When people are struggling and don't have enough, there's going to be some who have, and there's going to be some who don't. And social hierarchies, and a lot of that is based on scarcity. But in a state of abundance, when there's enough for everybody, things can be different. And that the way humans act tends to be different in different circumstances. This is the whole thing. Jordan Peterson has the whole thing about lobsters. He's like, well, lobsters have hierarchies. It's in our human DNA to create hierarchies. So therefore, we're always just going to have social hierarchies. Well, it's in our DNA to run, but we don't run all the time. We run when we need to. right? And that the nature of social hierarchies throughout the 10,000 years of human civilization that we've seen has changed a lot. We've had feudalism, we've had slavery, we've had modern liberal democratic states, we've had communism. The social hierarchies change based on the circumstances. And that humans have the capacity to act in different ways, and that as we reach a higher plane of existence and as we interact with our environment in a more efficient way, and that's really, the history of humanity is we're constantly forcing the environment to serve us, but we're constantly doing it in ways that are more advanced. We're getting better at forcing the environment to serve us. And as we force the environment to serve us in more and more efficient ways, as we expand our population, as we expand our living standards, you'll notice we become more free. And we respect people's rights more, and that our life expectancy expands, and we have a higher level of social autonomy and individualism. But at the end of the day, human beings are collective creatures. And, every building in the New York City skyline is the result of lots of people, thousands and thousands of people's collective labor. There's not a single product you can point to anymore in any store that like one person made that. No one can point to anything and say, I made that by myself. And even like some artisan, you say like a wood carver, right? He's got, he carved it all by himself, but he's using a tool, and that tool was made in a factory, and that
Sure.
human beings are collective in nature. Everything we've accomplished is collective.
But
However,
through hierarchies.
Sure. And that's the way we have to function at this time. But we want to get beyond that. We'd like to get to a society in which hierarchies are no longer necessary, in which technology has advanced to the point that human beings can just live a comfortable existence. But the basis of that is abundance. And I would argue, based on what I said before about poverty created by abundance, that the irrationality of the capitalist system holds us back from reaching that higher plane of existence. I feel like just as much as you, the death penalty is something I really think we ought to get rid of here in the United States. And honestly, if every country in the world could get rid of it, that would be great as well. But I look at countries that are in very different conditions than we're in. I've been to Iran many times, and Iran, they are not a Marxist government. They say they're neither capitalist or socialist. It's just Islam, but it's like they have 5-year plans. They have state planning and production. They're aligned with China and Russia and Venezuela, but they come out of an anti-imperialist revolution, but they have an Islamist ideology. But one thing in Iran is they use the death penalty pretty widely in Iran. But that's because on their border, they have these vicious heroin gangs that are known to go into people's homes and point guns at them and say, you do what we say or we kill you. And in order to combat them, the government has to have the same threat.
I assume heroin's illegal.
What?
I assume heroin's illegal in Iran.
Yes, but it's a big problem in Iran. And these vicious heroin gangs and some of these Islamist separatist groups that come over the border from Afghanistan and others, they are known to just, threaten people at gunpoint, do what we say or we kill you. And for the government to be able to fight them back, it has to be able to have the same kind of threat. It's like a military kind of situation.
Drug war is a problem overseas too.
Yeah,
and take away from that.
It's a pretty awful situation, and that the way we use the death penalty in the United States makes zero sense. It's not a deterrent. In the countries that in the third world that tend to use it, Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, you use drugs, we will kill you. Well,
it's totalitarianism.
But it tends to at least deter people from doing what they do. Here in the United States, we practice the death penalty in a way that has absolutely no impact. The guy, he only gets the death penalty if he commits a murder that's like so heinous, and then he doesn't get it for 20 years or something like that. Why are we doing this? It's almost like a strange religious ritual. It's a gesture to law enforcement that we think cops are so important, we'll kill one who kills one of them or something. It's not healthy. The way we do the death penalty here, it has no deterrent value, and it's really kind of a sick, unhealthy thing. Whereas,
let's go back to hierarchies a little bit. So, I played sports, as a child and an adult in a competitive, but not, not professional league. We had hierarchies there. There's hierarchies in nature, and there are some seemingly malevolent natural elements out there, tornadoes, floods, hurricanes. Like, I don't know if it's possible to get away from hierarchy and, certain types of, natural born oppression. It seems like it's just part of the default part of nature. And I include, human beings to a certain extent in nature. Like, there are going to be social hierarchies because we're not all born, from my perspective, we're all born with intrinsic human value, and that's all essentially the same, but we're not all born literally equal. Some of us are more articulate, some of us are better at math, some of us are very good at engineering, some of us are very good at sports, and it seems like there are going to be hierarchies that order themselves around those natural talents and abilities, and that those are things we should celebrate, not condemn. And there are going to be people who want to work harder too. Like I kind of working my ass off, for the LP. Probably not the smartest decision. I should be working my ass off for some, company that's going to pay me a ton of money. But I'm passionate. I love what I do, and I love the freedom to do that. And it just seems like trying to stamp out hierarchies is not something that's really going to work.
Well, I'll make this analogy.
Okay.
In a low-income family, the refrigerator is something that the parent has to very carefully regulate. The kid can't just open the door to the refrigerator and take what they want, because if they do, then there won't be stuff left when it's time for others to have it. And in a low-income family, the parent has to very carefully regulate that refrigerator. But in a very, very wealthy family, when there's so much food and there's so much abundance and there's no danger of running out of it, the refrigerator door can just be open. The kids can go in and take whatever they want at any point, because there's so much, right? And that the kind of regimentation where people are coerced to obey others. I'm not talking about some people being better at something, more physically fit, or having better skills at something. I'm talking about situations where people are being compelled to obey other people. Situations like that tend to be based on a level of scarcity. And the more you get to a higher level of abundance, the more we overcome them. In feudal society, a peasant couldn't look a noble in the face. They had a different language, right? I think thee and thou versus you. And, there was everything of feudalism was about regimenting a very strict social hierarchy. And the revolutions that created modern capitalism, with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, liberty, equalite, fraternite, were once we had reached a material level that had not necessitated that level of authoritarianism anymore. And that we had created enough of an abundance. People were saying this isn't necessary. People should have the freedom to choose their own religion, to say what they want to say, to move where they want to move, and that was a great thing. And the overthrow of feudalism was a great moment in human history.
I definitely don't like feudalism.
Sure.
I don't know if I want to be pushing for straight equality either, though. I mean, I may not want to share that.
Equality develops naturally as a result of abundance, but you can't force equality. And I think that is a misconception. I was taught that when I was in school too. Communists want everyone to get paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. And I don't know where people get this, because there was a lot of income differences in the Soviet Union, and there's more billionaires in China today than in many other countries. I think there's a millionaire created every day in China. Inequality is going to exist. You're going to have inequality in a socialist society. The question is, are the means of production, the centers of economic power, being forced to work in the interests of society overall, or are they being privately owned by a private owner who uses them to maximize his own profits? And I think that's the difference, right? There's going to be inequality. People should be rewarded for inventing things, for engaging in harder work. And actually, one of the problems with capitalism is that I would argue that the people who are the wealthiest and the most rewarded, are the people that just have money to begin with. I don't think that, the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Carnegies, I mean, maybe 100 years ago, they were great titans of industry, but, the circles of wealth and power that dominate the United States, these are not Howard Rourke's. These are not, Titanic inventors who worked at the sweat of their brow. They're people that enrich themselves primarily through usury. Which, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, every major religion forbids lending money at interest, because no real value is created when you lend money at interest. Money is created by other money, and that leads to a creditor class existing.
But there are a lot of self-made millionaires in the United States, and people who are fabulously wealthy. And that's one of the things we love about the United States from a libertarian perspective, is with all of its flaws, we still have upward economic mobility, and it's my choice. Not everybody wants to go that route, but the people that do, they can try.
Well, and this points to one of the weird aspects of where we are, and why a lot of communists don't particularly like me, but I seem to understand the way things are in Vietnam and Nicaragua and China, is that I wrote an article at one point pointing out that both Russia and China have heavily state-run economies. and criticizing libertarians for being sympathetic to them when I'm saying, look, there's a huge amount of state ownership and state control. And there was a libertarian critique of me for that article that was actually very insightful, that I learned a lot from, where they pointed out that, yes, that's true. In China, business is heavily regulated. The Russian economy is centered around state-controlled oil and state-controlled gas. But both Russia and China and Vietnam and Nicaragua and many of the modern socialist, anti-imperialist countries, they have worked really, really hard to facilitate a middle class of small business owners and entrepreneurs. In fact, when I went to Nicaragua, one of the things they brag about is their micro entrepreneurship program. The Nicaraguan government has a state-run, state-planned economy, but one of the main things they do to make it prosperous is they loan money to peasants and low-income people and people in the countryside to start their own businesses. And that has kind of the strength of 21st century socialism is entrepreneurs and middle-class people and people starting their own businesses, but doing that in coordination with an overall, state central plan to make sure that growth is uninterrupted. Deng Xiaoping, he said, poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. That's the quote from Deng Xiaoping, right? And that, again, some of the communist countries, I would say a lot of them, during the Cold War, because they were barricaded, because they were locked out of the global economy, they fell into the trap of trying to create an egalitarian society in poverty. And that was a disaster. The Cultural Revolution was a disaster. Che Guevara was very heroic around the world fighting imperialism, but when he was running Cuba's economy in the early 60s, he
kind of murdered a lot of people.
Well, he was involved in a military. He was a military leader. I mean, he was involved in armed struggle. I mean, but in terms of when he was running the Cuban economy, he had this concept of the socialist man, this idea that people would just work out of the goodness of their heart or something, getting rid of material incentives. And it was a disaster. And the Cuban government acknowledges that. They think it was heroic of him to go to Bolivia and organize the people in the countryside to fight for their rights. They think it was heroic of him to go to the Congo and fight colonialism. But his economic management of Cuba was not effective. And Cuba is moving toward the Vietnamese and Chinese economic model. And they'll tell you now the strength in Cuba is having a private sector and having a market sector, and you need that. You really do need that. I think markets are necessary, but they shouldn't have control over the vital sectors of the economy. The economy overall should be planned, but markets should be allowed to flourish. I absolutely believe that.
Can we have a choice in hospital? Like, there's so many. I've been to a government hospital and a private hospital, and I got to tell you, the difference is pretty night and day. Like, it's pretty frightening at this point.
Sure. I know some socialist societies have private hospitals and public hospitals. I know some of them have totally public hospitals. I mean, it's interesting how these words get mixed around, because it's like, Obamacare is just private healthcare, like regulated and kind of controlled. And then in Canada, you have single payer where the state is the insurer, but the hospitals are all private. It's just the government pays for everyone's, and then in Britain, you have national health care where the government actually owns the hospitals. All the doctors are government employees. And then in communist countries, you have, what I would call actual socialist healthcare, where the healthcare system, which sometimes does include private, aspects like in China, but it is part of an overall state planned economy to ensure growth and increasing living standards and livelihood of the population. And there's a lot of confusion about what these words mean. They have all kinds of different meanings. But when people say socialized medicine, what are they referring to? Are they the Canadian system, the British system, the Cuban system, Obamacare?
Some version of it.
There's some government involvement in healthcare to some degree or other in most countries. I mean, doctors have to be licensed. You can't just have anybody become a doctor, right? I mean, because then they could do surgery on somebody and not know what they're doing, right?
Well, I've done it at home. I've stitched a couple people up before, and that's what you do when you don't want to go to the doctor specifically, more so than just if you don't have money. When you don't want to go to the doctor, I glued someone's face closed over the summer because he did not want to go to the doctor. Turned out all right. Don't recommend it for everyone.
Well, but should that really happen though in a country with this much wealth and abundance? Do people have to be gluing their faces together?
Here's why it should. Because some people just don't want to do it. It's the same reason that we're never going to solve the homelessness crisis, not to insult anyone who I've done stitches on before or, use a little bit of super glue. There are people who they don't want to do it. They don't want to wear their seatbelt. They're just going to do their own thing. Like it's individualism. And I got to respect it. Even, sometimes everybody has a story, right? Of the person. I don't mean like a couple of minor stitches. Something terrible happens and they're like, I'm not going to the doctor. it's not my business. Ultimately, it's not my choice. Same as when people do drugs or like, okay, like I think the drug war has failed. I think drugs, we just got to legalize it.
I
Um,
agree.
I don't
I
think
do.
anybody should go shoot up heroin. Dude, terrible idea. Like, get your life together. But ultimately, I think state intervention does so much more harm than good, even with prostitution, which I think is just like, like a moral travesty. But more than that, like maybe a window into the dysfunction of our, humanity and cultural problems when it becomes, really out of control. But I just like I believe in the rights of the individual, and it's hard for me to reconcile individualism with communism.
Well, I mean, I would argue that all society is collective. The question is, what kind of collective? Are we
To what
collectively working to
degree?
make profits for our boss, or are we collectively having a vision for the society overall?
I mean,
I agree with you
maybe.
about legalizing drugs. The war on drugs has been a nightmare, and the drug problem is the result of U.S. government policy. In Central America, it is the
Yep.
result of Project MK Ultra and distributing hallucinogens by the CIA. It is the result of all kinds of things. You want to talk about a body count, this drug gangs on the border, that are killing people. Where did that come from? That came from in the 1980s. The U.S. government was sending weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua and to paramilitaries in El Salvador and Colombia. And those folks were also involved in the drug trade.
Yeah.
And they've been having problems down in that part of the world ever since, and
We
I mean,
just we're
where's the
engaged.
body
We're trying
count?
to do regime change in Peru, not that long ago. Yeah, it's U.S. government is not. We've developed a pretty horrendous track record in the last 100 years. I think.
Yeah.
Who
Yeah, I mean, if
decides?
somebody has a drug addiction issue, I mean, anyone who's been through recovery will tell you, unless they really want to stop, you can't
Yeah,
force them to stop. And that the last thing that would ever benefit somebody who is, turning to drugs because of, dealing with trauma or whatever, is to throw them in a jail with hardened criminals. That's not going to make things better,
sure.
and that stigmatizing people who have drug problems or demonizing them is not a good thing. I will say though that I also, while I am for drug legalization, I am also critical of the way the kind of the woke left glorifies drug use and makes it seem like drug
Yeah,
use is a good thing.
agreed.
I'm a pretty straight edge kind of guy. I don't even drink alcohol. And I feel like, that part of the social engineering that is behind a lot of the woke stuff is they want us all zoned out and high and
Yep.
yeah. So
Bread and circuses.
yeah,
Bread and circuses, and then government can do whatever it wants. I don't want to live in a pod and eat bugs. I assume you don't want that either.
nope,
Not into the World Economic Forum stuff. Do you
nope.
think that is communism? Is it related to it?
No, I
Like
would argue that what they're doing is that they are trying to stabilize capitalism with dramatic degrowth methods. We're still having production organized for profit, but we're having a big problem because of the fact that millions of people no longer have a place at the assembly line and all the technological breakthroughs. So they want to dramatically, forcibly degrow the population. And they want to keep countries in the developing world underdeveloped and impoverished. Joe Biden said one of his goals would be to prevent China from building power plants and
mhm.
electrical facilities in Africa. And then on top of that, they want to, drive down living standards over here. They
They
want,
do,
yeah,
yeah.
and that they are using government to do it.
But
Now,
they said they want
previously,
us
this
to
was
own
done with
nothing,
what's that?
right? They said it's whatever year you'll live in a pod, essentially, eat bugs, you'll own nothing.
Well, they're going to own a lot. They're going to own their big banks. They're going to
But
own
that
their
doesn't
oil
seem that
wells.
doesn't seem like capitalism if I don't get to own anything. Like
Well,
private property ownership is like,
they get to own stuff though.
yeah,
So
for sure. I
yeah,
guess maybe it's capitalism for them.
yeah.
I'd call it tyrannical global one world government, I guess. It's
And
globalism in the worst way,
it's
not in a
fascism.
positive
I mean,
way.
this is fascism. The Nazis, it's
Hmm.
interesting because the Soviet Union, they were really into science fiction. They were, because of space travel and all of
Yeah.
that. But Nazi Germany, a lot of their propaganda and their mythology was about the Middle Ages. It was about pre-Christian Europe, about Wagner and Valhalla and all that. And that Nazism was largely arguing we need to go backward. Right. The modern world is too chaotic. We need to try and restore some kind of element of feudalism. We need to go
Yeah.
backward. And they created a slave labor underclass. That was the concentration camp system. That was the first prison industrial complex where they were using, concentration camp inmates to do free labor for corporations, kind of like what goes on in American prisons today. And then they also, they restarted military spending, and with the Reichsbank, they created the first military industrial complex and rebooted their economy by having the government spend huge amounts of money on militarism. Then they also shamed women out of the workforce. They had this feeling that if a woman was working, she was taking a job away from a man, and so they pushed women out of the workforce. By doing that, they eradicated unemployment. They had an economic boom for 2 or 3 years, but by about 1939, the German economy was falling apart again, and World War II came about largely as a result of the fact that their degrowth measures to try and stabilize the capitalist system by forcibly degrowing, they are only temporary solutions. And I would argue the same about what the World Economic Forum is doing today. You can tell us all that we have to accept poverty because of climate change. You can reduce our wages and living standards. You're still not escaping the built-in problems of production organized for profit.
Interesting. To me, it's very much like government regulatory frameworks and government-induced monopoly that has these problems. But I guess that's the main point where we differ. We've been going for almost an hour. I just want to ask a couple more things to really get kind of an understanding of what your core values are. How big of a problem do you think greed is in the United States and just in general with human nature?
What is greed? Greed is wanting more than you already have. I'm not against that.
Okay,
right?
yeah, because I'm unsure too. I hear the greed tossed around a lot. It was very much like a '90s thing. Do you know what I mean? Like anti-corporate '90s, against the man, don't sell out. And it seems like communism is often pushing back against this greed boogeyman, and then you have Ayn Rand fans and the Atlas Society who almost characterize it as this virtue. And I know I'm not doing them a service by saying that. They'd flip out, but that's how it comes across, as this cartoon villain of greed. Oh, I love being like a dragon with your gold.
I think wanting more than you already have and wanting to expand, wanting to have a better life for your children than you have, that is just the built-in nature of humanity.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm not against that. I guess the issue is that I think when people talk about greed, they're more talking about people that are looking to maximize profits and would violate the rights of other people.
Would hurt someone, or have willful disregard.
But even that, they're making it a moral thing, right? They're not saying the problem is the system. They're saying, well, it's just this person who has this character flaw, this moral flaw of greed. And so they're kind of missing the point. They're not in agreement with me when they say
What about envy? Do you think there's any difference? Do you distinguish them?
I do. And that, it's interesting because, Friedrich Nietzsche was very critical of socialism. And a good friend of mine who is an academic wrote about how Friedrich Nietzsche spent all of his time, he never read Marx. He read the socialism of a very prominent German economist that was an envy socialism, right?
Okay.
And that Marx, he's not talking about envy. It's not like, oh, the rich people have so much money and you don't have it, and that's no fair. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the laws of history, how societies develop over time, how production can be organized rationally to ensure growth and prosperity for all. I mean, I don't see envy, and envy is a very negative emotion, right? If you're motivated by that, you're not going to get very far. So I view envy in a rather negative light.
Same.
Not that it's not there among communists or among the woke left, especially. It's certainly there, but I don't see it in a positive light.
Yeah, with the woke left, I really feel like their desire for violent, bloody revolution here in the United States, a lot of it is fueled by envy and nihilism and personal just discontent. And I mean, you mentioned Jordan Peterson before, and I wish that they would pick up his book and read about it and just do some personal self-reflection before just trying to tear down Western civilization.
Well, what do you think about? I want to comment on that because, after Lenin died, there was a fight between Stalin and Trotsky, and Stalin won out and Trotsky lost. What was that fight about? Trotsky advocated permanent revolution. And that he spent most of his life not in Russia, but in exile in Europe. He was very well known in Paris and Vienna, and he was kind of enthralled with the revolutionary intellectuals. And he wanted to march communism all over the world and have the permanent revolution. Whereas Stalin said, well, no, we have our way of doing things here in Russia. We'll sign peace treaties with America, with other countries, and we're going to build up our own country. And that was a divide. And Stalin, you know, he came from a Christian background. He went to seminary school. He was from Georgia. And you know, Trotsky was this wealthy middle-class intellectual. And that divide, that Stalin-Trotsky divide, that was the very beginning, I would argue, of what we now understand to be the woke left. Then later, after the Second World War, the CIA launched a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And that was where the CIA started funding communists and leftists who were against the Soviet Union. And that's where the Frankfurt School comes out of. Theodore Adorno, Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, Mary McCarthy, names like that. And those folks, they were very against the Soviet Union, and their leftism was very much a leftism not of organizing the economy to ensure that there's economic growth, but rather of vengeance, of social nonconformity, and really hatred for humanity, for the people. And that the woke stuff is the result of an attempt on the part of American intelligence to create distance between the Soviet Union and the middle-class radical intellectuals who might be aligned with it because they were attracted to communism. And you know, the George Soros foundations and all of that had a lot to do with the color revolutions that brought down the Soviet Union. And now I would argue that apparatus has been brought back to the United States, that basically they've brought back their global apparatus of progressive and, you know, community-oriented people to try and impose their degrowth agenda on us here in the United States. And that this was a divide, and that, yes, I mean, the Cultural Revolution in China, I have met many people from China who lived through the Cultural Revolution. I have never met anyone who said it was good. I have met a couple people who said they felt it was necessary because there would have been, you know, China would have had an overthrow and they would have gone back to being poor or something like that. But none of them thought it was good. Right. And that we can all agree that the gulags were horrendous, and all kinds of people who did not belong in those gulags, innocent people, ended up there. People were turning in their neighbors. There was mass fear, and that was horrendous. And that, you know, I have urged people in the communist community, these gulags memes, they're not funny. Cut that out. It's not funny. If you had a relative who died in that, you wouldn't think that was funny, you know? But I will say the same about helicopter memes, because I've met a lot of Chileans and I've met a lot of Argentine folks. And, you know, I mean, you know, the amount of mass murder of communists, you know, just for saying what they believe is massive. And that's not funny either. And I think trivializing human life is something we need to get past. It's fun on the internet, right? You just want to, when you're digging your enemy, oh, I want to throw you in a gulag. I want to drop you out of it's childish.
Well, it's fun until your friend says my family and I fled the Chilean government.
Yeah.
Then it's not fun. It's funny until you meet someone who said, you know, like both of my grandparents died in the gulag. Then it's not so funny.
It's a way of erasing the humanity of your political opponent.
You can sweep your problems under the rug by laughing about it. And I think that it's very healthy to do that with certain problems, and it's very cathartic. But it's not an antidote to solving some of the worst atrocities in human civilization. We don't just get to like laugh and move on if we're in danger of repeating them.
Yeah, you shouldn't trivialize human life, you know, and I really urge people not to do that. And that I think even the strongest Stalin defenders will admit that 1936, 1937, there was a heavy wave of political repression in which a lot of innocent people got hurt. And you can argue about why. I know Stalin eventually, you know, executed the head of the secret police, you know, blaming him for it. And so some people make arguments.
He's accountable. I mean, I could tell you, as the person who's in charge of an organization, it all falls back on me. You know, I've got to be accountable for everyone's failures and successes and whatever at the end of the day. I don't get to just take credit for the good stuff. I got to take credit for the shit too.
Sure. Well, you'll notice though, nowadays in Russia, Stalin is wildly popular because people remember him as the guy who defeated the Nazis, as the guy who industrialized the country, who raised them up from nothing. I mean, he's wildly popular. And that was one thing I've heard so many times in my life. When I tell people I'm a communist, they say, oh, haven't you ever met anyone who actually lived under communism? And I slap myself on the face and I say, have you seen the polls in every formerly communist country in Eastern Europe about how life was better and the nostalgia is very high? You know, and that, you know, here in the United States, our government has gone over the world waging bloody wars and killing people to fight communism. And we've opened our doors and given automatic visas and automatic citizenship to people who flee from communist governments. So the side of the story that we're getting from the people who flee to the United States, that's one side of the story. I don't think they're lying. I think they're speaking to their real experience. But, you know, wars tend to have two sides, you know.
Sure.
And so I encourage people to look at it that way. But there you go.
I appreciate you being being frank about there being two sides. You know, we've been talking for a little bit over an hour. I think we should wind down. I really appreciate you having this conversation with me, though. I think you've been more open about the failures and perceived successes of communism than anyone else I've spoken to,
Thank you.
especially publicly. I really appreciate that you don't like the woke left and that you're not all about that. I'd like to kind of continue a dialogue, and I feel like we were a little bit all over the place today, which is probably just fine for covering a lot because it's kind of our first public conversation. But I'd like to jump in again, maybe in a couple weeks, and dig into maybe Mao's Cultural Revolution. It's something that James Lindsay's been talking about a lot, and maybe you can kind of help us navigate that because people here are kind of freaking out, and we're wondering what the hell's going on. It seemed like a really horrible thing. It seems like you're not on board with it either, and
Nope.
maybe you could kind of help us unpack a little bit of it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, do you
Awesome.
want to talk about that now, or this is for another
Well,
time?
let's wrap soon. I need to go. I need to go feed the baby. It's been going
Okay.
for about an hour, and
Well, I
you
really
know,
appreciate this opportunity to engage with you, and I will say you were, this is a lot different than my debate with Stefan Molyneux. I'll tell you that much. So
yeah, no, well, that's because that's a one and done. You know,
yeah,
that's a
sure,
one and done, and I'd rather have a much lengthier dialogue, and I don't think that it does much. I'm not really into gotcha conversation.
sure. Yeah. Well, that's not productive. And the
It's
main
not.
thing right now, and I think this is the main thing, we've got to stop the war and we've got to stop the police state, and that is
Absolutely.
the urgency of the moment right now. And I'm willing to work with anyone who wants to do that. And if somebody doesn't want to do that, if they want to send more weapons to Ukraine, or they want to, throw Julian Assange in prison for the rest of his life because he, leaked, the crimes of the American government, but they call themselves a communist, that doesn't mean anything to me at this point, right? And I'm more concerned about where people stand on the actual issues because things are getting intense. I mean, I don't know. I think I talked to you a little bit about what's happened with the Uhuru movement. That case needs to be on the front page of every newspaper ever. I mean, this is a group of black activists who had some anti-war protests, and they went to some conferences in Russia, and now they're trying to claim that their activism is being a foreign agent, and they're trying to send them to prison for 10 years. The Department of Justice has indicted them. That's huge, and if they
Yeah.
can get away with that, they can basically outlaw events like Rage Against the War Machine. That's insane. And it fits a whole pattern. Look, these anti-abortion protesters who just got arrested, right, for blocking
Yep.
doors, right? They
Yep.
called it conspiracy to violate civil rights by blocking a door. And they're facing a sentence of 11 or 12 years in prison for blocking some doors in an anti-abortion protest. The sentences that are being handed down to January 6th people right now are insane. I mean, we are moving toward a very heavy-handed police state in the United States as we set the stage for World War III. And this is an urgent situation, and the time for playing Sim City and arguing about, well, my utopia looks this way. Yeah, well, my utopia looks that way. That time has passed, right? And as much as I will defend to some degree or other the legacy of communism internationally, I'm an American. I love my country, right?
Hmm.
And the only type of socialism that we're ever going to have here is going to be an American form of socialism. In China, they call their socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's going to be socialism with American characteristics here. It's not going to be some foreign ideology. Gus Hall, who was a longtime Communist Party boss in the United States, he said that the American people, they would not accept the Constitution without the Bill of Rights. They won't accept socialism without some kind of Bill of Rights. We're going to have a big emphasis when socialism comes to the United States on civil liberties, and there will probably be special provisions protecting private entrepreneurship. The American people have a unique flavor, but we believe in growth. We believe in optimism. We believe that we can build a better world. We can achieve our dreams. And right now, it is the big monopolies, the big
Hmm.
banks, the big corporations
Hmm.
that are trying to utilize the government to set up a low-wage police state and make sure that that can't happen. And I don't think the American people are going to accept that. I think the uprising is coming because everything that the degrowth woke left is doing right now is against everything that is in our bones as American people. So, I think there might be some agreement on some of the things I just said among libertarians. I
Certainly.
can only hope.
There absolutely are. I appreciate it. I hope that, I don't want communist revolution. If it has to happen, I hope the wokies don't counter revolutionary and murder you.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate that we're able to have dialogue like this.
Yeah,
And we're
it's
able to
important.
engage. Yeah.
It's
So
really important for us to be able to have an open dialogue. The country really needs it right now. We've got to be able to talk about our differences. I am a strong proponent of national divorce. I am not a strong proponent of bloody armed conflict.
So that
I
would be
want,
balkanization. You think the country should have states
if
break
it
away?
wants to, yeah. If there's a desire, there is a desire with New Hampshire and with certain Texans. So at least strong federalism. I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
But all right, let's wrap up. Let's get into that next time. I really appreciate
Okay.
everybody tuning in on this. I know there were a lot of people on the left watching this and probably curious to see how I treated you. And so even if they hate my ideology, I hope, they respect that I'm not a wild animal on the internet, just in my memes, not in my
I can hope
conversations.
for the same thing from your side. I can hope that people appreciated what I had to say as well.
Absolutely.
All right.
All
Thank you
right,
very
we'll
much.
close now. Thank you.